Firstly, Sheikh, thank you very much to you and to everyone here today for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you to discuss such an important subject. I'm the founder and director of a charity called Beyond Conflict, which is the mental health charity for victims of war, displacement, and terrorism. And a bit like you, I didn't start out in this field. I was for a couple of decades actually, a journalist. I used towards the back end of my journalism career, I used to cover conflict zones and wars, and I wrote books. And it was while doing that work that I came across the issue of the desperate need for mental health for victims of war, and that led to the formation of Beyond Conflict in 2018. So can I begin by saying that when the war in Ukraine began in February 22, the UN chief Antonio Guterres gave this quote. He said, "For predators and human traffickers, the war in Ukraine is not a tragedy, it's an opportunity, and women and children are the targets." This statement is probably true for all wars. By mid-2023, UNHCR said that 108 million people were forcibly displaced globally, and that's probably the highest level for about 30 years. And I read a report from Reuters on human trafficking hotspots, and it said that wars in places like Ukraine and Gaza were making the problem even worse. And it's not just a very serious and grave human rights issue. It's really become a global financial industry and a crime that generates well in excess of 150 billion per annum, as Keith Best described earlier. But it's also undermining economies, it's undermining national security, and that is one of the reasons why it's now becoming a more urgent priority for governments around the world. War feeds human trafficking. Regions in which active warfare is raging become magnets for traffickers themselves. They seek out people, usually women and children, who've been displaced and are the most vulnerable. And human traffickers see war as effectively a payday. And the awful reality is that they have a willing and ready customer base in the West for trafficked people. For example, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, demand for trafficked victims in the West actually spiked. Thomson Reuters did a report based on data which showed that there was a 200 to 600% rise in the use of internet search terms related to sex, pornography, and Ukrainian women in the weeks after the conflict began. In other war-torn places such as Gaza, Yemen, and Sudan, there have also been significant spikes in human trafficking activity in the wake of war, according to government sources. So in addition to human traffickers, we've also seen cases of child abductions by states. Ukraine has seen around in excess of 19,000 or more documented cases of children who've been taken from Ukraine to Russia in forcible abductions. But the Ukrainian Human Rights Commissioner said that that figure could actually be dwarfed by the reality that he put at hundreds of thousands of children taken into Russia. And this latter figure has not yet been independently verified, but some put the figure as high as 700,000 Ukrainian children taken forcibly into Russia. The Catholic charity Caritas said, and I quote, "Today in Gaza, Ukraine, Yemen, and many other places in the world, there are conflicts which see women facing violence and suffering. Women and children make up 80% of the world's displaced people due to conflict, and therefore they are more likely to be victims of trafficking," end quote. So these people face the risk of being trafficked, not just on their journey, but even when they reach a place of safety, their destination, places like the UK. And this has been raised by quite a number of the previous speakers. Ukraine alone has about 6 million refugees. 90% of those who have fled, women and children. In a report by the International Organization for Migration at the UN, its report said that there are certain factors that help trafficking. Things like state collapse, deteriorating rule of law, forced displacement, humanitarian need, and socio-economic stress, as well as society and family breakdown. And war creates all of these above conditions. In Gaza, we've seen 2 million people who've been internally displaced following the Israeli bombing after the October 23 Hamas attack. That's 85% of the Gazan population who are living with the unprecedented trauma caused by loss of family, loved ones, home, witnessing bomb attacks. These are children and young people who are alone and vulnerable, without services, without food and water. And these vulnerable people may be the subject for demands for sexual exploitation and trafficking. The risk of never being able to escape is really, really high. And for those that do eventually escape, the mental health toll can last a lifetime. If it's not treated, it can be handed down 2 or possibly 3 generations later. So it has to be addressed. And the thing is, even when these people reach a place of safety, their mind continues to be ravaged by the horrors of the past. And this is what Beyond Conflict is really interested in. And I want to just say that there have been various reports that have talked about the kind of things that affect victims of exploitation and trafficking. The mental health impact can manifest in things like depression, PTSD, panic attacks, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, or attempts. And I read a horrific figure which said children as young as 5 in places like Gaza are having suicidal thoughts. So you can really think about that. That cannot leave you. I want to also say that even when they escape, they live with the terror and they struggle to overcome that terror, which takes me back to a story that inspired me to form Beyond Conflict back in 2018. I'm nearly there, Sheikh. Back in 2016, I was writing a book about ISIS as its brutal tyranny raged across Iraq and Syria. I met a really young Yazidi girl at a refugee and IDP conference in Windsor Castle, and she had escaped sex traffickers under ISIS. And if you imagine back at that time, the UN was reporting that ISIS was selling babies as young as 1 year old, to basically trafficking them for sex at 1 year old. This Yazidi girl had escaped those traffickers, and she was now safe in the UK. And she told me, and our now chairman of the charity, Ed Newell, that even when refugees like her reached a place of safety, they were still terrified and trapped by the horror going round in their head. And she used a phrase. She said to me, "We need psychiatrists desperately on the ground because our people are drowning in memories." That was her phrase. And that sentence never left me. And it led to the formation of Beyond Conflict just over a year later. And we've since done work helping widows and orphans in southern Iraq. We've helped the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh who fled the genocide in Myanmar in 2017. We've a couple of projects helping people in the Middle East, including Palestinians in the West Bank. We've also done a lot of work helping Ukrainian refugees. In the last few weeks, we had a Child of War exhibition, which I think Saf visited and Sheikh visited. And the whole point of this exhibition, which featured artwork by children around the world showing how war impacts children, this exhibition was a real eye-opener for so many people because it showed the level of trauma that war causes for children. And on the back of that, we hosted a conference about the impact of war on children and their mental health last Thursday. One of our speakers was a lady called Yulia Osmolowska, who heads a PTSD task force in Ukraine. She told our audience that 80% of Ukraine's children will suffer some form of PTSD as a result of the war. 80%. Trafficking is just one of the weapons of war that's being waged upon children's bodies and minds today. And Yulia used this quote, which I want to share with you. She said, "The deepest scars of war are in a child's soul." And that sentence weighs on all of us. It's why your work here, and it's why our work at Beyond Conflict and your work and so many others here today is so urgent and necessary. And it's why we should all work together to end this. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.